All right, let's jump into another deep dive. This one is kind of crazy. Feels like it's straight out of the headlines. A story about big changes, tough decisions, the whole safety versus freedom thing. We're heading down to El Salvador, a country that not so long ago was basically all about gangs and fear.
Yeah.
Now, though, they're boasting the lowest homicide rate in the entire Western Hemisphere.
Wow.
It's a huge turnaround, so huge that everyone's talking about it. We've got a recent article from ABC News with the facts and figures.
Okay.
And we also pulled up a Reddit discussion that is just bursting with opinions, all kinds of different perspectives.
It's interesting.
So get ready, because we're about to explore what happens when a whole nation's wrestling with a question that has no easy answers. Can you really have peace without giving up the very rights that make a society free?
Man, that's a question that goes way beyond El Salvador's borders. It's not just about numbers, it's about what people go through when they try to create safety, especially in a place that's been hurt by violence for so long.
And yeah, the numbers themselves are pretty shocking. Back in 2015, El Salvador had a whopping 6,656 homicides, making it one of the most dangerous places on Earth.
Oh, wow.
Then, jump ahead to 2024, that number drops to just 114. That's a decrease of over 98%.
Really?
It's hard to even imagine a change that big.
It's crazy, especially when you think about how much power the gangs had over the country for so long. The fear was everywhere, like part of everyday life. Imagine constantly feeling threatened, like walking down the street could get you killed.
I remember reading one comment on Reddit that really got to me. Someone was talking about their coworker's family who had fled El Salvador way back in the 80s during the Civil War.
Oh, yeah.
They were finally able to go back home after decades and walk around without being afraid, something they never thought they'd be able to do.
Wow.
That's the kind of change that affects generations.
For sure, but this newfound peace didn't just appear out of nowhere. There was a price to pay, and it's causing a lot of arguments, both inside El Salvador and internationally.
Right.
Back in March 2022, there was this horrible weekend where gangs killed 62 people, all in just a few hours.
Jeez.
That's when the government decided to declare a state of exception.
Okay, so this state of exception, it basically gave the government tons of power to deal with the gangs head on, right? Like they kind of tossed the rule book aside to get things under control.
Yeah, pretty much. They suspended certain constitutional rights, gave the police way more authority, and mass arrests just became normal. Over 83,000 people were arrested.
Whoa.
And most of them without due process.
Meaning
Meaning they were put in jail without a proper trial or even being officially charged with a crime.
wow, 83,000 people. That's insane. Seems like they were just rounding everyone up.
They definitely cast a wide net. And even though they later let go about 8,000 people, saying they were innocent, there is still lots of worries about human rights violations.
I bet.
There have been reports of 354 deaths
Yeah.
while people were in custody, which makes you really wonder about the conditions in those places and how the prisoners were treated.
So on the one hand, we've got this massive drop in murders, which obviously means things are safer and more stable.
Right.
But then there's this whole other side where they're basically ignoring basic legal protections. It's like they're trying to balance two things that don't really go together.
Exactly. It's a really tense situation, a clash between different values. And that's what makes this story so interesting. It makes us think about how much power the government should have, how do we balance security with individual freedom, and what choices a society makes when it feels like everything's falling apart.
And that Reddit discussion, man, it's like a perfect example of this whole debate. It's full of all these different opinions that show just how tricky these moral questions are. Some people are saying these extreme measures were the only way to stop the gangs from controlling the country, like the good outweighs the bad.
Yeah.
They point to businesses finally being able to operate without being extorted, families going to the park without being scared of getting shot, just a sense of normalcy coming back to a place that had almost forgotten what it was like.
And you can't ignore those stories. It's super important to understand what it was like for people who lived through years of terror and now finally feel safe.
Absolutely.
But then you have other voices who are worried about what this means for civil liberties.
Right.
About these increased powers being abused, and about the possibility of creating a society based on fear instead of law.
That makes sense.
They're afraid that even temporarily suspending due process sets a dangerous precedent, something that could have major consequences for El Salvador's democracy down the line.
It's like walking a tightrope, isn't it? And to make things even more complicated, some people on Reddit were pointing out that the murder rate was already going down in El Salvador before this whole state of emergency thing even started. They're arguing that while the violence has definitely decreased, it's not clear how much of that is actually due to the crackdown.
And that's a really important point. It's easy to assume that the state of emergency is the main reason for the drop in violence, but it's rarely that simple. There's always a bunch of factors involved, historical trends, social and economic conditions, even just random events.
Yeah, it reminds me of that saying, correlation doesn't equal causation. Just because two things happen around the same time doesn't mean one caused the other. Makes you wonder if maybe the violence was already decreasing before they took these extreme measures.
Exactly. And to complicate things even more, in 2024, they found a mass grave in El Salvador.
Oh, no.
At least 50 bodies were in it. And this discovery makes people question the official story. Are the reported murder statistics actually accurate?
That's pretty disturbing. Makes you think that maybe there's a darker side to all of this, something they're trying to hide. It really shows how important it is to think critically, to question even the most obvious-seeming data, and to get different perspectives to really understand what's going on.
Absolutely. It reminds us that even with all the information we have nowadays, figuring out what's true and what's propaganda can be really difficult.
Yeah.
And in a situation as complex as El Salvador's, where the stakes are so high, it's even more important to do that.
Oh, sure, we've got this huge decrease in murders.
Yeah.
But it's tied up with all these questionable tactics, stats that might not be accurate, and a mass grave that kind of throws a shadow over the whole success narrative. It's obvious that there's way more to this story than meets the eye, and we need to keep digging to uncover the truth.
For sure.
Feels like we're peeling back layers of an onion here, and it just keeps getting more and more interesting and, honestly, a little bit scary. We can't talk about El Salvador without talking about the guy in charge, President Nayib Bukele. He's kind of a controversial figure globally, isn't he?
He is, no doubt about it. And you can't deny his role in this dramatic shift. He's built this very specific image, a mix of tech-savvy millennial leader and strongman who's willing to do whatever it takes to get things done. And it's an image that really works on a lot of Salvadorans, especially those who went through the worst of the gang violence.
Right. He's incredibly popular, Rice. Off the charts approval ratings. He's always on social media, talking directly to people, completely bypassing traditional media. It's like he controls the narrative in a way most politicians can only dream of.
Yeah, his use of social media is definitely part of his popularity. It lets him present a very controlled version of events to make himself look like a strong leader taking decisive action. But, we got to remember, popularity can be a tricky thing. It can be a force for good, but it can also be used to shut down opposition and hold on to power.
And that's where the concerns about him maybe being a little authoritarian come in, right? Like, he won a second term even though the Constitution has term limits. The Supreme Court, which is pretty much seen as being on his side, made it possible. That definitely makes you wonder, is he really all about democracy, or is he just into power for power's sake?
It's a valid concern, and a lot of people are keeping a close eye on it. It's a thin line between a strong leader and an authoritarian one, a matter of degrees. And in Bukele's case, well, his actions seem to show he's not afraid to bend or even break the rules if it suits him.
So what's next for El Salvador? Can they keep this up? Can a country that's basically become a police state maintain these super low crime rates forever? What happens when the state of emergency ends? Will all those people they released from prison without even charging them just go back to their old ways? Is this peace just a temporary thing built on something that's going to fall apart eventually?
Those are the million-dollar questions. The situation in El Salvador right now is kind of like a high-stakes experiment with potential wins and losses. It's too early to say for sure if it's going to work long-term or what the consequences will be down the road. But we got to pay attention, analyze what's happening, and be willing to have those tough conversations about what happens when you prioritize security above everything else.
It's like they're at a fork in the road with two completely different paths ahead of them. One leads to a future where everything's safe and orderly, but at the cost of personal freedom and the rule of law. The other leads to a future where freedom and democracy are most important, but the threat of violence might still be there, looming over everything.
And the big question is, which path will El Salvador choose? And maybe even more importantly, what can other countries learn from their experience, especially those dealing with their own problems?
Seems like we're constantly reminded that there are no easy answers, no quick fixes for complex problems. El Salvador's story really drives that point home. It challenges what we think we know, makes us face some uncomfortable realities and pushes us to think critically about the kind of world we want to live in. It's almost like El Salvador is holding up a mirror, like forcing the rest of the world to think about these really tough questions about the choices we make as societies. What are we willing to give up for safety? Are there some lines we just shouldn't cross, even when faced with terrible violence?
That's a debate that's been going on forever, and El Salvador is just the latest example. Throughout history, governments have turned to authoritarian ways during crises, promising safety and stability while slowly taking away individual freedoms. Sometimes it works, at least for a while, but a lot of times it creates more problems than it solves, leading to more repression and instability.
It's definitely a warning, makes you wonder, are we so quick to embrace these strongman tactics because we want easy answers in a world that feels totally crazy and out of control?
It makes sense to want simple solutions when you're scared and uncertain. But if we look back at history, those easy answers usually have a hidden price tag. For El Salvador, the question is whether that price is going to be worth it in the long run.
I think this deep dive has really shown us how important it is to stay informed, to look deeper than the surface, and not just believe everything you see at first glance. It's easy to get caught up in the headlines, the big stories, the promises of quick fixes, but as we've seen in El Salvador, there's always more to it.
Right, we can't just accept information blindly, especially with social media where misinformation spreads so quickly. We need to be asking those tough questions, looking for different perspectives, and being willing to challenge our own beliefs.
Yeah, and maybe the most important thing is being okay with not knowing all the answers. El Salvador's situation reminds us that the world is messy and complicated, and there are rarely easy solutions.
And that's exactly why it's so important to have these thoughtful conversations, to hear different opinions, and to approach these difficult issues with some humility. El Salvador's story isn't over yet. It's still going on, and it's going to have consequences far beyond its own borders. It's a story that needs our attention, our critical thinking, and our willingness to face the hard truths.
Yeah, so as we wrap up this deep dive into El Salvador, I'm left feeling cautiously optimistic. I hope that maybe, even with all the challenges, a country can find a way to create lasting peace without losing the very values that make it worth fighting for. But I also know that it's not going to be easy. There will be twists and turns, and the choices made today will have consequences for years to come. Thanks for joining us, everyone, and as always, keep those minds curious and keep questioning.